You've said that the course of history may be determined to a very significant degree by what the people of the United States will have learned from the catastrophe, meaning, of course, the Vietnam War. What, in your opinion, have we learned from this experience?
I would say very little, unfortunately. At the time I wrote that, which I guess was 7 or 8 years ago, what I had in mind was that there are really two different ways of looking at this catastrophe. One can look at it as a failed venture, a mistake, something which was...
It was a mistake because it failed.
Mistake because it failed, but perfectly all right if it succeeded. And I think it's probably fair to say that at least among intellectuals, people who write and speak publicly... That
You've been rather harsh on the intellectuals.
Yeah, I think they're totally unprincipled on this. I mean, I think the dominant view is that if we had gotten away with it, it would have been all right, but we couldn't get away with it, so therefore it was stupid, and therefore we should get out. You know, worse than a crime, it was a blunder or something of that sort. Now, if that's all that's learned from it, I think it'll have no effect on future history. It will have shown that there are limits to American imperialism.
And your opposition has been on moral grounds, that it was wrong from the outset, although you said your opposition came 15 years too late.
Well, active opposition came 15 years too late. I think the time for active opposition should have been about 1950 or a little later. But I didn't become really actively engaged in opposing the war until about 1964 or 65. And at that point, the United States was very deeply involved in what, if we were honest, we would call aggression against South Vietnam. That's in fact what it was. But I had, of course, always been opposed to the war.
The Vietnam War actually began for the United States in 1950. And from 1954 to 1960, the U.S. had a kind of a Latin American-style terror regime in place. And it wasn't any joke. They killed about 60 or 70,000 people, but there was no protest. I mean, zero. When Kennedy took over, they escalated it to, pretty soon it became a direct U.S. attack. Still no protest. I mean, through the early 60s, you couldn't get anybody to sign a petition. I mean, nobody would come to a meeting. I remember we used to try to organize meetings on Vietnam. Some of the few people, couple of students, a few others who were interested, but we'd have to put together half a dozen topics. I mean, Iran, Venezuela, you know, Vietnam, 6 other topics, and then maybe you could get more people than organizers. By 1965 or 1966, it was becoming a big issue. But protests were met with extreme hostility. I mean, take Boston right here. And this is a pretty liberal city. But we couldn't have public protests against the war. They'd be violently broken up. The speakers would be saved from being murdered only by hundreds of state police. And it would be praised, the protests would be, the attack on the protesters would be praised in the liberal media. I remember my wife, I had 2 little girls. My wife and the 2 kids went to a women's protest. It was, you know what it's like. I mean, they're not throwing stones, just people walking around with children. And this was in Concord. It's a suburb, quiet, professional, upper-middle-class suburb. I mean, they were attacked. People throwing tin cans and tomatoes and so on, and that was considered right, you know. It wasn't until late 1966 that there was enough of a change so you really had substantial public opposition. And that's 5 years after the war was started. By then, there were hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging around South Vietnam, and the war, of course, extended to the rest of Indochina. And nobody knows how many people were killed because nobody counted. So, I mean, another interesting thing about the Vietnam War is we have no idea what the costs were to the Vietnamese. I mean, for the United States, we know down to the last person. And the big post-war issue is finding the bones of American pilots. But nobody has any idea how many Vietnamese died.